The Sogdians, the merchant people who ran the ancient world's economy. They never built an empire. They never conquered anyone. They had no army, no navy, no emperor. What they had was something more powerful, a network. Sogdian merchants ran the Silk Road for over 1,000 years, from Chang'an in China to Constantinople in Europe, trading silk, horses, glass, spices, and information across the most dangerous terrain on Earth. Their letters, buried in a Chinese watchtower for 16 centuries, give us the world's oldest surviving merchant correspondence. Their language became the lingua franca of Central Asia. And when the Tang dynasty of China threw the greatest parties in the ancient world, the entertainment was Sogdian. Who were the Sogdians? How did merchants without an army dominate a continent? And what happened when the world stopped needing middlemen? The Sogdians lived in one of the most improbable places for a commercial civilization, deep in the heart of Central Asia, surrounded on almost every side by desert, steppe, and mountain, in a region that most people today could not find on a map without assistance. The land they called home was Sogdiana, the territory centered on the fertile river valleys that cut through the desert plateau between the Amu Darya, the ancient Oxus, and the Sir Darya, the ancient Jaxartes, two of the great rivers of Central Asia that flow northwestward from the Pamirs and the Tian Shan Mountains toward the Aral Sea. Within this generally arid landscape, the river valleys and their associated oases were islands of extraordinary fertility. The Zaravshan River Valley, whose name means scattering gold in the local language, a reference to the golden color of the autumn poplars that line its banks rather than to actual gold deposits, was the heart of Sogdiana, a valley of orchards, vineyards, grain fields, and silk-producing mulberry trees that supported the dense population of the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. These were not desert outposts, but genuine cities, with populations of tens of thousands, surrounded by agricultural hinterlands of impressive productivity. The Sogdians belonged to the eastern branch of the Iranian language family. Their language was a close relative of Old Persian and of the other Iranian languages spoken across the vast territory from the Aegean coast to the borders of China. This linguistic connection placed them within the broad cultural world of Iranian civilization, the world of Zoroastrianism, of Iranian epic poetry, of the specific social and aesthetic traditions that the Iranian peoples had developed across the centuries, while their geographic position in Central Asia gave them a cultural context that was simultaneously Iranian, steppe nomadic, Buddhist, and Chinese. The Sogdian oases, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kish, Marakanda, were urban centers of genuine sophistication by the time the historical record allows us to see them clearly, and they had probably been significant settlement centers for centuries before the first textual references. The archaeological evidence from sites in the Zaravshan Valley shows a Bronze Age settlement pattern with substantial craft production and evidence of long-distance trade connections that predates any written documentation, suggesting that the commercial orientation of Sogdian culture was not something suddenly developed in the historical period, but was a continuation of much older patterns of specialized production and exchange. The environmental context of Sogdian civilization, the oasis landscape of extraordinary fertility surrounded by desert and steppe, shaped the Sogdian approach to the world in fundamental ways. A people who lived in islands of productivity, in a sea of inhospitality, learned early that survival required both the intensive development of the productive resources available in their home territory and the active management of connections with the wider world beyond the oasis boundaries. The agriculture that fed the cities required sophisticated hydraulic engineering to function. The irrigation systems that brought water from the rivers to the fields required sustained investment and maintenance that only organized communities could provide. and the trade that supplemented agricultural income required connections with distant markets, the ability to move goods and people across the dangerous steppe and desert terrain between oases, and the commercial intelligence to know what was wanted where. The steppe nomads who inhabited the vast grasslands surrounding the Sogdian oases were simultaneously the Sogdians' most dangerous neighbors and their most important commercial partners. The nomads needed the agricultural products and manufactured goods that only settled civilizations could produce: grain, textiles, metalwork, luxury items. The Sogdians needed the nomads' horses, their protection, their access to the distant pastures where specific luxury animals were bred, and, crucially, the safe passage through their territory that the steppe routes required. The management of this relationship, the cultivation of connections with successive waves of steppe nomadic powers that gave the Sogdian commercial network access to the steppe routes while minimizing the predatory aspects of nomadic power, was one of the most important dimensions of Sogdian political and commercial intelligence. Samarkand is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, and for much of its long history, it has been understood, by those who lived there and by those who visited, as a place of particular significance in the geography of human civilization. Its position at the center of the Eurasian landmass, at the intersection of the routes connecting China to the west, India to the south, and the steppe world to the north, gave it a geographic centrality that expressed itself in commercial and cultural significance across multiple millennia. The ancient city, known in the historical sources as Marakanda and located at the site now identified as Afrosiab, a low hill north of the modern city of Samarkand in Uzbekistan, was already a substantial urban center when Alexander the Great captured it in 329 BCE. Alexander's description of the city in the accounts of his campaign suggests a well-established urban center with significant population, defensive walls, and the material culture of a prosperous commercial civilization. The later Greek historian Arrian, drawing on contemporary accounts of the campaign, notes that the city was large and prosperous, understated praise from a man describing the city to readers who knew the great cities of the Hellenistic world. The urban landscape of Sogdian Samarkand combined the practical requirements of a commercial city with the aesthetic ambitions of an elite that valued visual sophistication alongside commercial success. The palaces of the Sogdian aristocracy, of which the site at Panjakent, south of Samarkand, provides the best preserved example, were decorated with wall paintings of extraordinary quality and remarkable iconographic richness. The Panjakent frescoes, excavated by Soviet and Tajik archaeologists from the 1940s onward, and now displayed in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and in the Tajik National Museum in Dushanbe, show a world of feasting nobles, epic battles, mythological scenes, and the specific visual vocabulary of Sogdian aristocratic culture that had no direct parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. The social organization of Sogdian cities was distinctive in the ancient world for the relatively high status accorded to merchants, the commercial class that in most ancient civilizations occupied a position below the warrior aristocracy and the priestly establishment. Sogdian society was organized around the recognition that commercial success was the primary source of both individual wealth and collective prosperity, and the merchants who organized and executed the long-distance trade that was the foundation of Sogdian economic life occupied a social position that gave them genuine prestige alongside their material wealth. The specific character of this merchant culture, the combination of cosmopolitan openness to multiple cultural traditions, practical intelligence about commercial conditions across a vast geographic range, and the social skills needed to negotiate effectively with partners from dozens of different cultural backgrounds, shaped the broader character of Sogdian civilization. The architectural tradition of Sogdian cities combined defensive functionality with genuine aesthetic ambition. The hilltop fortresses, of which the ruins at Bunjikat, Panjikent, and Mount Mug in Tajikistan are the best preserved examples, were built from the same compressed mud brick that was the standard construction material of the Central Asian oasis world, but their structural engineering was sophisticated enough to produce multi-story buildings with elaborate interior organization. The specific building form known as the Iwan, a vaulted or barrel-roofed chamber open on one end to a courtyard, was one of the most important architectural elements of the Sogdian tradition, and its subsequent spread throughout the Islamic architectural world is one of the more direct channels through which Sogdian architectural ideas influence the medieval world. The religious life of the Sogdians was one of the most genuinely tolerant in the ancient world. Not tolerant in the modern sense of believing that all religions were equally true, but tolerant in the practical sense of allowing multiple religious communities to coexist, practice, and trade within the same social space without systematic discrimination or violence. This practical religious tolerance was not a philosophical achievement, but a commercial necessity. A people whose livelihood depended on maintaining commercial relationships with partners from dozens of different religious traditions could not afford to make religious identity a barrier to commerce. The foundation of Sogdian religious life was Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian religion that centered on the worship of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of truth and light, through the maintenance of the sacred fire and the ritual practices associated with the Avestan tradition. The fire temples that the Sogdian cities maintained were the centers of community religious life, and the specific Zoroastrian concepts that shaped Sogdian moral imagination, the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, the importance of honest dealing in commerce as an expression of devotion to Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian horror of pollution, and the associated emphasis on cleanliness and physical purity, were not merely abstract theological positions, but practical moral frameworks that shaped daily commercial life. Buddhism arrived in Sogdiana from the south, through the commercial routes that connected the Sogdian oases to the great Buddhist civilizations of India and the Eastern Iranian world, sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era. The Sogdian response to Buddhism was characteristically practical. They adopted the elements of Buddhist thought and practice that they found useful or appealing: the cosmopolitan ethics, the sophisticated philosophical tradition, the ritual repertoire, while maintaining their Zoroastrian identity as a cultural foundation. The numerous Buddhist monasteries and stupas that appeared in the Sogdian cities alongside the Zoroastrian fire temples were not evidence of conversion, but of the Sogdian capacity to maintain multiple religious traditions simultaneously. Manichaeism, the syncretic religion founded by the Babylonian prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE, combining elements of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Christianity in a dualist theological framework, found in the Sogdian merchants some of its most effective propagators. The Manichaean missionaries who carried the new religion eastward along the Silk Road were frequently of Sogdian ethnic background, or were operating through Sogdian commercial networks, and the Manichaean scriptures were translated into the Sogdian language among the earliest translations, making Sogdian one of the primary languages of the Manichaean literary tradition. The Sogdian willingness to engage seriously with Manichaeism reflects the broader intellectual openness of the commercial culture, the capacity to engage with new ideas from whatever direction they came. Nestorian Christianity, the form of Christian belief associated with the patriarch Nestorius, condemned as heretical by the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE, but widely practiced in the Persian Empire and along the eastern trade routes, was another religious tradition that the Sogdians encountered through their commercial connections, and that established a presence in the Sogdian cities. The Nestorian Christian communities of Samarkand and the other Sogdian centers were not large, but their existence speaks to the genuine religious diversity of the Sogdian world, and to the capacity of the Sogdian oasis cities to accommodate religious difference as a normal condition of commercial life. The votive deposits and religious objects found in Sogdian archaeological contexts reflect this religious diversity in the material record. Zoroastrian ossuaries, the containers used to hold the bones of the dead after the exposure of the body had allowed the flesh to decompose, as Zoroastrian practice required, appear alongside Buddhist stupas and images. Christian crosses appear in contexts that also contain Zoroastrian fire temple installations. The material evidence of Sogdian religious life is a patchwork of traditions that defies simple characterization, and that speaks to a society that approached religion with the same pragmatic pluralism it applied to commerce. The agricultural productivity that sustained the Sogdian oasis cities depended on hydraulic engineering of a sophistication that was among the most impressive in the ancient world. The Zaravshan River and its tributaries provided the water that made agriculture possible in the desert environment of Sogdiana. But that water had to be captured, distributed, and managed with precision to maintain the productivity of the fields and orchards on which the city's food supply depended. The canal networks, the distribution weirs, the check dams, and the maintenance institutions that organized and sustained this hydraulic system were as fundamental to Sogdian civilization as the commercial networks that distributed its products. The main canal systems of the Zaravshan Valley, some of which are still in operation today, having been maintained continuously for 2,000 years or more, demonstrate the long-term institutional investment that hydraulic agriculture required. A single major canal could supply water to hundreds of kilometers of agricultural land and required the coordinated labor of the thousands of farmers who depended on it for maintenance, clearing, and repair. The social institutions that organized this collective maintenance, the water allocation agreements, the community labor obligations, the administrative oversight, were as important as the physical engineering, and their preservation across centuries of political change speaks to the deep social investment in the hydraulic infrastructure that made the oasis civilization possible. The mountain fortresses of Sogdiana, of which the site on Mount Mug in the Zaravshan Valley above Panjikent is the best known because of the remarkable cache of documents found there in 1933, were the administrative and military centers of the Sogdian city-states, positioned on commanding hilltops that provided both defensive security and visual control over the agricultural territories below. The Mount Mug fortress, occupied in the early 8th century CE during the Arab conquest period, preserved a remarkable collection of documents written on leather and wood that included administrative texts, commercial correspondence, and personal letters that give us an unparalleled window into the daily life of a Sogdian community in its final years of independence. The paper-making technology that the Sogdians eventually transmitted to the Islamic world was one of their most consequential contributions to the subsequent history of human civilization. Paper had been developed in China by the early centuries of the Common Era, and Sogdian merchants who traded extensively with China were among the first non-Chinese to understand and master the paper-making process. When Arab forces captured Samarkand in 751 CE and took prisoner Chinese soldiers who had been fighting alongside the Sogdian defenders, the knowledge of paper-making that those prisoners possessed was transmitted to Arab craftsmen, and from Arab paper-making, the technology eventually spread to Europe, where it made possible the printing press, the mass production of books, and the intellectual revolution of the Renaissance. The silk textile production of the Sogdian oases was another dimension of Sogdian technological achievement, and the specific designs of Sogdian silk, above all the characteristic pearl roundel pattern with confronted animals at the center, are among the most widely distributed artistic motifs in the medieval world. Sogdian weavers produced textiles of extraordinary quality, using the complex draw-loom technology that allowed the production of large-scale patterned fabrics in multiple colors. And these textiles were traded across the entire Eurasian world. Fragments of Sogdian silk have been found in churches in France and Germany, in burial mounds in Scandinavia, and in tombs across China. The physical residue of a commercial network that truly spanned the known world. The commercial achievement of the Sogdians is best understood not through the lens of any individual transaction or any single trade route, but through the concept of the network, the interlocking set of commercial relationships, family connections, shared cultural identity, and mutual commercial intelligence that gave Sogdian merchants a collective advantage over any competitor who tried to operate the same routes without the same network infrastructure. The Sogdian commercial network was not a monopoly. Other peoples traded along the Silk Road, but it was an integrated system of information, trust, and practical support that made Sogdian merchants more effective than their competitors across almost every dimension of commercial practice. The Sogdian commercial diaspora, the network of Sogdian merchant communities established in cities across the Silk Road, from Merv in the west to Dunhuang and Chang'an in the east, was the physical infrastructure of this commercial network. These diaspora communities provided the Sogdian merchant traveling far from home with accommodation, credit facilities, commercial intelligence about local market conditions, relationships with local authorities, and the linguistic and cultural mediation needed to conduct business with non-Sogdian partners. A Sogdian merchant who arrived in a new city could expect to find other Sogdians who spoke his language, shared his cultural and religious background, and were embedded in the local commercial environment in ways that would help him conduct his own business more effectively. The ancient letters preserved in the desert, a cache of Sogdian documents found in a watchtower at Dunhuang in northwestern China, dated to approximately 313 to 314 CE, are the oldest surviving merchant correspondence in the world, and they give a vivid, intimate picture of the Sogdian commercial network in operation. The letters, written on paper in the Sogdian script, apparently abandoned when the watchtower's mail relay system collapsed, were sent by Sogdian merchants in China back to their home communities in Samarkand. Their content ranges from commercial reports about market conditions and the prices of specific goods to personal news and family concerns, from requests for specific merchandise to complaints about debtors who had failed to pay. One of the letters, the text scholars call the First Old Sogdian Letter, is particularly famous for its vivid description of conditions in China during the period of political turmoil following the collapse of the Western Jin dynasty. The letter's author, writing in the voice of a woman named Nanai Dat, reporting on behalf of the merchant Nanai Vant, describes with remarkable directness the disruption of the commercial routes, the destruction of cities, the deaths of merchants, and the general conditions that made commercial activity in China extremely difficult. "I would rather be a dog or a pig than a Chinese woman," she writes, a line that has been quoted by every historian who has discussed this remarkable document, because its directness and emotional immediacy cut across 2,000 years of time with extraordinary force. The goods that moved through the Sogdian commercial network were as diverse as the geographic range of the network itself. Silk, the luxury textile that gave the Silk Road its name, was the most famous commodity, but it was by no means the only or even the most important one. Horses were among the most commercially significant commodities of the Central Asian trade, with the Chinese Tang dynasty paying extraordinary prices for the large horses bred in the steppe and mountain regions that the Sogdians could access. Glass, produced in the workshops of the Syrian and Levantine world, was a luxury good of great value in Central Asia and China, where glass-making technology had not been fully developed. Spices, incense, medicinal substances, dyes, and gemstones also moved through the network in both directions. The specific commodity of information, commercial intelligence about market conditions, political developments, the movements of armies and caravans, and the reliability of specific trading partners was perhaps the most valuable thing that the Sogdian network produced, and it was traded as deliberately as any physical commodity. A Sogdian merchant who knew that a drought in a particular region would reduce the grain supply available for purchase, or that a new ruler in a particular city was imposing new commercial regulations, or that a rival caravan had been robbed on a specific route, possessed information that translated directly into commercial advantage. The cultivation, verification, and distribution of this information through the network was a form of collective commercial intelligence that no individual merchant operating outside the network could replicate. The political organization of the Sogdian world was deliberately decentralized in a way that suited the commercial character of the civilization. Rather than organizing itself into a single unified state under a single political authority, a form of organization that would have made Sogdiana an attractive target for conquest while providing minimal additional commercial benefit, the Sogdian world was organized as a loose confederation of city-states, each maintaining its own local sovereignty, its own ruling family, its own commercial and diplomatic relationships with the surrounding powers, while sharing the broader cultural, linguistic, and commercial infrastructure that gave the Sogdian world its coherence. The individual Sogdian city-states, the principalities of Samarkand, Bukhara, Kish, Maymurg, Panjikent, and others, were each ruled by a local lord, the Ikshid, or the comparable title used in each city, whose power was based on the combination of military control of the agricultural territory surrounding the city and commercial management of the trade passing through it. The specific character of Sogdian rulership combined the warrior aristocratic traditions common to the Iranian cultural world with the commercial sophistication demanded by the economic character of the civilization, and the most successful Sogdian rulers were those who could manage both dimensions simultaneously. The diplomacy that the Sogdian city-states conducted was sophisticated, pragmatic, and fundamentally oriented toward the preservation of the conditions for commercial activity, rather than toward territorial expansion or ideological objectives. The Sogdians were perpetually surrounded by more powerful states, successively the Achaemenid Persians, the Macedonian Greeks, the Seleucid successors of Alexander, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, the Parthians, the Kushan Empire, the Sassanid Persians, the Western Turkic Khaganate, and ultimately the Arab Caliphate. And the consistent Sogdian diplomatic strategy was to maintain workable relationships with whichever power was currently dominant in the region, while cultivating hedging relationships with other powers that might become useful if the primary patron weakened or proved too demanding. The relationship between the Sogdian city-states and the successive steppe nomadic powers that dominated the Central Asian steppe was the most commercially important and most diplomatically demanding aspect of Sogdian political life. The control of the steppe caravan routes, the vast overland passages between oases that were the primary long-distance commercial arteries of the Silk Road, depended on the goodwill of the nomadic peoples who inhabited the steppe, and that goodwill had to be maintained through a combination of tribute payments, commercial relationships that gave the nomads access to goods they could not produce themselves, and the cultivation of personal relationships between Sogdian commercial and political elites and the nomadic leadership. The Western Turkic Khaganate, the nomadic empire that dominated the Central Asian steppe in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, was the most important single patron of the Sogdian commercial network during its peak period, and the relationship between the Sogdian city-states and the Turkic Kagans was one of mutual dependence. The Kagans needed the commercial revenues and the luxury goods that the Sogdian network provided. The Sogdians needed the protection and the route security that Turkic military power guaranteed. The specific mechanism through which this relationship was managed, the appointment of Sogdian commercial advisors to the Turkic court, the Sogdian role in managing Turkic diplomatic correspondence, the integration of Sogdian merchants into the Turkic imperial economy, created a functional partnership that sustained the Silk Road's greatest period of commercial activity. The encounter between Alexander the Great's Macedonian army and the resistance of the Sogdian leader Spitamenes was one of the most frustrating military experiences of Alexander's entire career of conquest, and the campaign in Sogdiana lasted 3 years longer than Alexander had anticipated, a sustained guerrilla war that demonstrated the limits of conventional military power against a determined resistance operating in difficult terrain with the support of the local population. Alexander captured Maracanda, Samarkand, with apparent ease in 329 BCE, as part of his eastward advance following the destruction of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. But the capture of the city was not the conquest of Sogdiana. Spitamenes, a Sogdian nobleman who had briefly cooperated with Alexander before deciding to lead resistance, organized a guerrilla campaign that exploited the steppe routes, the nomadic cavalry connections, and the local support that a Sogdian leader could mobilize in ways that Alexander's army, operating far from its bases and supply lines, could not effectively counter. The specific military problem that Spitamenes posed was the classic challenge of guerrilla warfare against a conventional military superior. The guerrilla force could strike at isolated detachments and supply lines, while refusing to offer the pitched battle in which the conventional army's advantages would be decisive, then disappear into the steppe when the superior force concentrated against it. Alexander's response, systematic devastation of areas that supported the resistance, the construction of forts at strategic points, and the recruitment of local allies whose knowledge of the terrain could match that of the rebels, was effective eventually, but required sustained commitment over 3 years. The eventual suppression of the Sogdian resistance involved both military operations and the kind of political engagement through which Alexander typically sought to consolidate his conquests. His marriage to Roxana, the daughter of a Sogdian noble named Oxyates, who had held out against Alexander in a nearly impregnable mountain fortress, was a political act that converted a potential enemy into a prominent supporter and demonstrated to the Sogdian aristocracy that cooperation with the new ruler could bring status and influence rather than simply subjugation. The pragmatic accommodation that many Sogdian aristocrats reached with the successive rulers of their region, the Macedonians, then the Seleucids, then the Greco-Bactrians, was the political expression of the same commercial pragmatism that defined Sogdian civilization more broadly. The cultural impact of Alexander's conquest on Sogdiana was substantial and lasting, despite the brevity of direct Macedonian rule. The Greek influence that entered Sogdiana through the Macedonian and Seleucid periods left traces in the artistic traditions, in the commercial practices, and in the cultural vocabulary of the Sogdian elite that persisted for centuries. The specific form of the Sogdian city-state, the local lord in his palace, surrounded by armed retainers and managing both the agricultural hinterland and the commercial traffic through his territory, incorporated elements of the Hellenistic court model alongside the older Iranian and steppe traditions. The remarkable wall paintings of the Sogdian palaces, with their combination of Hellenistic figure types, Iranian mythological content, and steppe animal-style elements, are the visual expression of this cultural synthesis. The wall paintings of Panjikent, the best-preserved examples of Sogdian pictorial art, discovered during Soviet archaeological excavations of the ancient city from the 1940s onward, provide the most vivid surviving picture of Sogdian aristocratic life at its height. And they depict a world of extraordinary visual richness, cultural sophistication, and apparently genuine joie de vivre. The feast scenes, the epic battle narratives, the mythological episodes, and the images of musicians, dancers, and entertainers that decorate the walls of Panjikent's temples and palaces show a civilization that invested heavily in the pleasures of life and that communicated its values and its identity through the most vivid visual means available. The feast was the central social institution of the Sogdian aristocratic world, the occasion at which relationships were maintained, statuses were performed, alliances were confirmed, and the collective identity of the elite was renewed through shared experience. The feast scenes in Sogdian art show nobles reclining on cushioned divans, attended by servants with wine and food, entertained by musicians playing the lute, harp, and flute, and by dancers whose movement is captured in the painter's confident lines with a dynamism that speaks to direct observation of actual performance. The specific instruments depicted, the barbat, a plucked string instrument that was the ancestor of the European lute, the transverse flute, the frame drum, are the same instruments whose introduction into China through the Sogdian cultural influence is documented in Chinese sources. The Tang dynasty of China, which ruled from 618 to 907 CE, and which is generally regarded as one of the high points of Chinese civilization in terms of political achievement, economic prosperity, and cultural creativity, maintained an extraordinary enthusiasm for things Sogdian that is documented extensively in Chinese textual and material sources. The Tang imperial court employed Sogdian musicians, dancers, and acrobats as entertainers whose exotic appeal was a mark of cosmopolitan sophistication. The Central Asian music and dance styles that the Sogdians had developed, with their specific rhythmic patterns, their specific instrument combinations, and their characteristic performance styles, became fashionable in Tang China to a degree that makes the Sogdian cultural influence on Tang entertainment culture one of the most extensively documented examples of cultural transmission in the pre-modern world. The specific dance form, known in Chinese sources as the Sogdian whirl, a spinning dance performed by male dancers, was particularly famous in Tang China and appears in numerous Chinese paintings, poems, and ceramic figurines. The poet Li Bai wrote about it with evident fascination, describing the spinning motion that seemed to defy gravity and the visual spectacle of a skilled practitioner. The Sogdian acrobats, who performed at Tang court entertainments, were celebrated in poems and depicted in the vivid three-dimensional ceramic figures that survive in Chinese museums and private collections. Three-dimensional documents of a cross-cultural entertainment tradition that flourished at the intersection of the Sogdian and Chinese worlds. The religious art of the Sogdian world, the paintings on the walls of fire temples and private chapels, the carved ossuaries that house the bones of the dead, the small votive figurines deposited at shrines, combined Zoroastrian theological content with artistic techniques and iconographic elements drawn from multiple traditions. The specific Sogdian mythological narratives depicted in the Panjikent paintings, episodes from the epic cycles of the Rustam tradition, scenes from the myths of Nana, the great goddess, and Verethragna, the war deity, are the most detailed surviving visual record of the Sogdian religious imagination, and their interpretation has been one of the central projects of Sogdian art history since the Panjikent paintings were first conserved and studied. The most dramatic individual in the history of Sogdian connections with China was not a merchant, but a military commander, a man of Sogdian and Turkic parentage named An Lushan, whose rise to the highest levels of Tang military power and whose subsequent rebellion against the Tang court in 755 CE triggered one of the most devastating civil wars in Chinese history. The An Lushan Rebellion, as it is known in Chinese historiography, nearly destroyed the Tang dynasty, killed millions of people, and fundamentally altered the character of Chinese imperial governance. It also represents the endpoint of the period of Sogdian cultural influence on China. After the rebellion, the Tang court became significantly less welcoming to the Central Asian cultural influences that had been so fashionable in the previous century. An Lushan's career illustrates the degree to which Sogdian individuals and their descendants had penetrated the highest levels of Tang military and political life. He was born on the northeastern frontier of the Tang Empire, in the zone where Chinese, Turkic, and Sogdian cultural worlds intersected, and his personal background combined linguistic and cultural competencies from all three traditions. His ability to speak multiple languages, Chinese, Turkic, and other frontier languages, was one of the factors that brought him to the attention of senior Tang officials and that accelerated his rise through the military ranks. By the 740s CE, he was commanding substantial frontier armies and had become one of the most powerful military figures in the empire. The specific Sogdian merchant families who appear in Chinese archaeological sources, documented through the epitaphs of Sogdian merchants who died in China and were buried according to both Chinese and Sogdian customs, give a more mundane but historically valuable picture of Sogdian commercial life in China. These epitaphs, discovered in Chinese tombs of the 6th through 8th centuries CE, record the lives of individuals who left Samarkand or other Sogdian cities as young men, established themselves in the Chinese commercial world, built successful businesses, married into Chinese families, raised children who were culturally Chinese, and died in China, surrounded by descendants who maintained some awareness of their Sogdian heritage, even as they were fully integrated into Chinese society. The Sogdian translators and scholars who facilitated the transmission of Buddhist texts from Sanskrit into Chinese were another category of Sogdian individual whose contribution to Chinese cultural history was significant. The translation of the Buddhist canon from Sanskrit into Chinese, one of the great translation projects in the history of world religion, involving hundreds of translators working over several centuries, required individuals who were competent in both Sanskrit and Chinese, as well as knowledgeable in Buddhist theology. The Sogdians, with their linguistic facility and their familiarity with the Buddhist traditions of Central Asia, provided a significant proportion of the translators and intermediaries who made this transmission possible. The Battle of Talas in 751 CE, fought near the Talas River in what is now Kyrgyzstan, between the Arab Abbasid Caliphate and its Tibetan, Turkic, and Sogdian allies on one side, and the Chinese Tang dynasty forces on the other, is one of the most consequential military engagements in the history of Central Asia, and its outcome shaped the subsequent religious and cultural character of the region for over 1,000 years. The Tang defeat at Talas ended Chinese military expansion into Central Asia and opened the region to the full force of Islamic cultural and political influence, while the Arab victory confirmed the Abbasid Caliphate's position as the dominant power in the region. The specific military events of the battle are relatively well documented in both Arab and Chinese sources. A Tang army commanded by the Korean-born general Gao Xianji had been conducting military operations in the Fergana Valley region when it encountered a combined Abbasid allied force. The Tang forces were initially successful, but the defection of the Karluk Turkic cavalry that had been fighting alongside the Tang, who switched sides to the Abbasid forces at a critical moment in the engagement, turned the battle decisively against the Chinese. The Tang army was defeated, and Gao Xianji withdrew with the survivors, effectively ending Tang military presence in Central Asia. The consequences of the Talas defeat extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. The Tang military withdrawal from Central Asia removed the primary political protection that the Sogdian city-states had relied on to balance against Arab pressure, and it accelerated the process of Arab and Islamic cultural dominance in the region. The gradual conversion of the Sogdian population to Islam, which had been resisted as long as there were political alternatives, accelerated after Talas, and within a century or two, the specifically Sogdian cultural and religious identity that had distinguished the oasis cities for centuries was giving way to the new Persian Islamic cultural synthesis that would define Central Asia for the subsequent millennium. The papermaking knowledge that spread from this engagement, transmitted by Chinese prisoners of war captured at Talas and subsequently employed in papermaking workshops established in Samarkand, was perhaps the most significant practical consequence of the battle for the subsequent history of human civilization. The Samarkand papermaking workshop, established by the Arabs using this knowledge, became the first paper production center outside China. And from Samarkand, technology spread westward to Baghdad, to Egypt, to North Africa, and eventually to Europe, where it made possible the printing press, mass literacy, and the information revolution of the early modern period. The information that flowed through the Sogdian commercial network was not only commercially valuable, but politically significant, and the Sogdian merchants who moved through multiple political jurisdictions in the course of their commercial activities were naturally positioned to observe and report on political and military conditions that states with more limited geographic reach could not easily monitor. The extent to which this information gathering was deliberate, whether Sogdian merchants systematically reported political intelligence to the Sogdian city-state governments or to their patrons among the steppe nomadic powers, is difficult to establish from the surviving evidence. But the structural position of the Sogdian network in the information landscape of Central Asia made them de facto intelligence assets for any power that could cultivate their cooperation. The ancient letters found at the Dunhuang Watchtower, which we discussed in the episode on Sogdian commerce, are not just commercial documents, but intelligence reports in a broad sense, providing the writer's assessment of political and military conditions in China to a distant audience who could use that information for commercial decision-making. The specific details in these letters, the identity of the Han Chinese emperor who had been killed, the military forces that had devastated specific cities, the disruption of the postal relay system that had prevented earlier letters from being delivered, were exactly the kind of information that a commercial organization needed to manage its operations in a politically unstable environment. The use of the Sogdian script, which had spread far beyond its ethnic homeland to serve as the writing system of multiple Central Asian peoples, including the early Turks, as a medium of diplomatic correspondence between states that lacked shared scribal traditions, was another dimension of Sogdian influence on the information environment of Central Asia. The Sogdian script's adoption by the Turkic peoples and its subsequent adaptation to write Mongolian and Manchu gave it a genealogical legacy that extended far beyond the historical period of Sogdian political relevance. The vertical Mongolian script, still used in Inner Mongolia today, is a direct descendant of the Sogdian script, carrying the graphic memory of the ancient oasis civilization into the 21st century. The textile patterns that served as markers of commercial identity and quality standards in the Silk Road trade were another form of commercial intelligence embedded in the goods themselves. The specific pearl roundel patterns of Sogdian silk, which served as identifiers of Sogdian-produced textiles in markets across the world, were themselves a form of branding, communicating to the buyer information about the origin and quality standards of the goods. The widespread imitation of these patterns by non-Sogdian weavers was a form of commercial fraud that the Sogdian merchants had to navigate, and the management of the authenticity signals embedded in textile design was a practical commercial intelligence challenge of real complexity. The two most commercially significant commodity flows in which the Sogdian network participated, the trade in Chinese silk moving westward and the trade in Central Asian horses moving eastward into China, illustrate the complementary nature of the Silk Road exchange that the Sogdians managed and the specific ways in which their geographic position gave them control over goods that both sides of the trade system desperately needed. Chinese silk was the defining luxury commodity of the ancient world, a textile of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication that could not be produced outside the specific environmental and cultural context of China, and whose production technology the Chinese state guarded as a strategic secret for centuries. The demand for silk in the Roman world was large enough that the Roman moralist Pliny complained about the drain of Roman silver to the east that it represented, and the demand in the Persian world was no less intense. The Sogdian merchants who moved silk from Chinese markets to Western markets were not merely commercial intermediaries, but strategic resources. The people who could navigate the political and geographic barriers that separated producer and consumer, and who possessed the commercial intelligence to manage the transaction profitably for all parties. The horse trade that the Tang dynasty conducted with the nomadic peoples of Central Asia, exchanging bolts of silk at fixed rates for the large steppe and mountain horses that the Tang cavalry required, was one of the most institutionalized commodity exchanges in the ancient world, and the Sogdian merchants, who operated in both the Chinese and nomadic commercial worlds, were naturally positioned to facilitate and profit from it. The specific horses that Tang China valued most, the heavenly horses of the Fergana Valley in what is now Uzbekistan, large animals with a distinctive gait and stamina that made them outstanding military mounts, came from a region that was commercially and culturally Sogdian, and the trade network through which they reached China was primarily organized and staffed by Sogdian merchants. The technological transition that undermined the Sogdian overland commercial network was gradual, but eventually decisive. The development of more reliable and more commercially efficient maritime routes connecting the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea, routes that moved large quantities of goods with lower unit costs than the overland Silk Road could achieve, slowly redirected the flow of commerce away from the Central Asian oases. The Sogdian network, which had been built around the specific conditions of overland Silk Road commerce, was not easily adapted to maritime trade, and as the proportion of inter-regional commerce moving by sea increased, the commercial significance of the Sogdian oases declined. The encounter between the Sogdian city-states and the expanding Arab Islamic civilization was the most consequential cultural challenge in Sogdian history, and the Sogdian response to it, a combination of military resistance, diplomatic accommodation, and gradual cultural absorption, was ultimately unsuccessful in preserving the distinctively Sogdian cultural identity that had been the foundation of the civilization's character for over a millennium. The Arab military conquest of Transoxiana, conducted in a series of campaigns through the late 7th and early 8th centuries CE, was more prolonged and more contested than the Arab conquests of Persia and Syria had been, partly because the terrain and the political fragmentation of the region made sustained resistance possible, and partly because the Sogdian city-states had access to steppe nomadic allies whose cavalry could challenge the Arab forces on tactical terms that the Persian infantry forces had been unable to match. The resistance of the last Sogdian king, Devashtich of Panjikent, documented in the remarkable cache of documents found on Mount Mug, lasted until approximately 722 CE, when his fortress was finally taken and he was executed. The gradual conversion of the Sogdian population to Islam in the decades and centuries following the Arab conquest was a complex social process that involved both coercion and genuine intellectual engagement with Islamic thought. The Islamic educational system, the mosque-based learning that emphasized Arabic literacy and the study of the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence, offered opportunities for the children of converted families that the older Zoroastrian and Buddhist educational institutions could not match in the new political environment. The Sogdian elite who converted to Islam and acquired the Arabic literacy needed to participate in the administrative and intellectual life of the Abbasid Caliphate were able to maintain and even improve their social position. Those who held to their traditional religious identities faced increasing disadvantage in a world organized around Islamic norms. The cultural contribution that the converted Sogdians and their descendants made to the Islamic civilization of Central Asia was enormous, and it represents one of the more important dimensions of the Sogdian legacy. The Persian language literature that flourished in Sogdiana from the 9th century onward, produced by the descendants of the Sogdian population, writing in a language that combined Arabic religious vocabulary with the Iranian literary tradition, was one of the most creative literary flowerings of the early Islamic world. Poets like Rudaki, scholars like al-Bukhari, and the geographical and commercial knowledge embedded in the Islamic geographical tradition all drew on the legacy of the Sogdian commercial civilization, even as they expressed themselves in new linguistic and religious frameworks. The city of Panjikent, the town in the upper Zarabshan Valley, whose ruins have yielded the most complete picture of Sogdian urban life at its height, was the last significant Sogdian city to resist Arab conquest, and its final years are documented in the Mount Mug documents, with an intimacy that allows a surprisingly personal reconstruction of the city's end. The last ruler of Panjikent, Devashtich, left behind not just his fortress and its documents, but a human story of political miscalculation, desperate resistance, and ultimate defeat that humanizes the abstract historical process of cultural transformation. Devashtich had been appointed as governor of Samarkand by the Tang dynasty of China, who were attempting to use their political relationships with the Sogdian city-states as a counterbalance to Arab expansion in the region. His political strategy, maintaining the Tang connection while seeking allies among the Turkic nomadic peoples of the steppe and attempting to build a coalition capable of resisting Arab pressure, was rational in theory, but failed in practice because the Tang were too distant to provide effective military support, and the Turkic alliances proved unreliable when confronted with the Arab military. The documents from Mount Mug, which include administrative texts recording the governance of Devashtich's territory, commercial correspondence from Sogdian merchants continuing their trade even as the political situation deteriorated, and personal letters that give glimpses of individual lives caught in the collapse, are a historical treasure of remarkable intimacy. They preserve, in the original voices of people writing for practical purposes rather than for historical posterity, the texture of a civilization in its final days. The merchants still conducting business, the officials still managing the administrative routines of the state, the personal concerns and relationships of individuals whose world was being destroyed around them. The fall of Panjikent did not mean the immediate disappearance of Sogdian culture. The language, the artistic traditions, the commercial practices, and the religious life of the Sogdian community persisted for decades, and in some cases for centuries after the city fell. But the political independence that had provided the institutional framework within which the Sogdian cultural identity had been maintained was gone, and the gradual absorption of the Sogdian population into the Persian Islamic cultural world of the Abbasid Caliphate proceeded without the institutional resistance that only a functioning state could have organized. The most direct surviving linguistic descendant of the ancient Sogdian language is Yagnobi, a language spoken today by approximately 12,000 people in the Yagnob Valley of Tajikistan and in Dushanbe, to which many Yagnobi speakers were forcibly relocated during the Soviet period. The Yagnobi language is not identical to ancient Sogdian. It has changed significantly over the 1,000 years since ancient Sogdian was a living language. But it is the sole surviving representative of the Sogdian branch of the Iranian language family, preserved by the geographic isolation of its speakers in an inaccessible mountain valley that the successive rulers of the region had little reason to penetrate. The people of the Yagnob Valley are the last living community whose language connects them directly to the ancient Sogdian civilization, and their linguistic and cultural heritage is the subject of significant scholarly and conservation efforts. The Soviet-era forced relocation of Yagnobi speakers from their mountain valley to the Vaksh cotton-growing region in the 1970s, an agricultural labor mobilization that severely disrupted the community and led to significant language loss, has been partially reversed as returned communities have re-established themselves in the Yagnob Valley. The documentation and revitalization of Yagnobi is one of the priority projects of Tajik linguistic scholars and of international organizations concerned with endangered language preservation. The modern cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in Uzbekistan, built on the ruins of the ancient Sogdian cities and containing some of the most architecturally magnificent Islamic monuments in the world, are the most visible heirs of the Sogdian commercial tradition. The Registan of Samarkand, with its magnificent tiled facades, the mausoleum of Ismail Samani in Bukhara, a masterpiece of early Islamic architecture that draws on the stucco decoration traditions of the Sogdian period. The bazaars and caravanserais that gave both cities their central role in Islamic period Central Asian commerce, all reflect the continuation of the commercial and urban traditions that the Sogdians had established in the same locations over a millennium earlier. The entrepreneurial legacy of the Sogdians, the model of commercial organization based on diaspora networks, shared cultural identity, commercial intelligence, and the trust infrastructure that allowed credit to be extended across vast distances, is the Sogdian contribution to the history of capitalism that deserves more recognition than it typically receives. Long before the Venetian merchants, the Hanseatic League, or the joint stock companies of early modern Europe, the Sogdians had developed a functioning model of long-distance commercial organization based on network trust, market intelligence, and the effective management of risk across geographic distances that would have defeated any less organizationally sophisticated commercial culture. The Sogdian script's genealogical legacy, the chain of script adaptations that carries the Sogdian graphic tradition into the vertical Mongolian script still used in Inner Mongolia, is a reminder that the most durable legacies of civilizations are often the practical, functional ones, rather than the monumental. The Sogdians left no great temples, no imperial palaces, no triumphal arches. They left letters in a watchtower, paintings on palace walls, textiles in distant tombs, and a script that shaped the written form of the languages of a continent. That is a legacy proportionate to a people who understood that the most powerful thing in the world is not an army, but a network. The caravanserai, the inn and commercial facility designed to serve the caravans that were the primary vehicle of overland Silk Road commerce, was one of the most important practical inventions of the pre-modern commercial world, and its development in the Sogdian cultural sphere represents a genuine contribution to the infrastructure of long-distance trade. The caravanserai provided not merely shelter and food for humans and animals, but also the commercial facilities, storage, weights and measures, money changing, and the presence of other merchants who could provide market intelligence that made the management of commercial operations across long distances practically feasible. The Sogdian caravanserai tradition, which was eventually adopted across the Islamic world and subsequently influenced the development of commercial inn traditions in medieval Europe, was one of the more practically significant institutional innovations in the history of commerce. The perfumes and aromatics that moved through the Sogdian commercial network, alongside silk and horses, were among the highest value commodities by weight in the ancient world, and the Sogdian role in the aromatics trade gives them a connection to one of the most intimate aspects of ancient luxury culture. The specific aromatics in question, musk from the musk deer of the Tibetan Plateau and the Central Asian mountains, civet from African and Asian civet cats, ambergris from sperm whales, and the various plant-based aromatic resins from the forests and savannas of India and East Africa, were the raw materials from which the perfumers of the ancient and medieval world created the luxury scents that were essential accessories of the aristocratic life across every culture from China to Rome. The Sogdian merchants who traded these aromatics possessed both the commercial connections needed to source them from their diverse geographic origins and the knowledge to authenticate and grade them, a form of quality expertise that was itself commercially valuable. The ceramic tradition of Sogdiana, the specific types of pottery and glazed ware produced in the Sogdian oases, is one of the more underappreciated dimensions of Sogdian material culture. The development of specific glazing techniques and decorative approaches in the Sogdian workshops of the pre-Islamic period, and the continuation and elaboration of these techniques in the Islamic period by craftsmen of Sogdian ancestry, represents a technical and aesthetic tradition of genuine quality. The green and turquoise glazed ceramics that became characteristic of Central Asian Islamic pottery draw on glazing traditions that were developed in the Sogdian oases, and their subsequent spread throughout the Islamic world carried elements of Sogdian technical knowledge into the ceramic traditions of the medieval world from Spain to China. The Sogdian numerical system and the broader mathematical tradition that the commercial requirements of long-distance trade had developed in the Sogdian cultural world was one of the practical intellectual achievements that the commercial orientation of the civilization had produced. The specific demands of commercial accounting across long distances in multiple currencies, involving goods of varying quality and quantity, and commercial relationships of varying duration and complexity, created incentives for the development of practical mathematical tools that a purely agricultural or military civilization would not have had. The transmission of mathematical knowledge from Central Asian and Indian traditions to the Islamic world, in which Sogdian scholars and translators played significant roles, was one of the channels through which the mathematical foundations of modern science were assembled from contributions across the Eurasian world. The glass beads that appear in archaeological contexts from Scandinavia to Japan, mass-produced in workshops that used raw materials from multiple geographic sources and distributed through the Silk Road commercial network, are among the most tangible physical evidence of the geographic reach of the trade network in which the Sogdians were central participants. The specific chemical compositions of ancient beads, analyzed by archaeochemists using modern techniques, allow the geographic origin of the raw materials to be determined with considerable precision, and the results consistently demonstrate that the ancient bead trade moved raw materials and finished products across distances that contemporary people would have considered extraordinary. The ubiquity of these small glass objects across the ancient world is a reminder that the Silk Road was not merely a luxury trade route for silk and spices, but a network that moved humble commodities as well as aristocratic luxuries, and that the commercial integration it represented was broader and deeper than the most famous commodities suggest. The role of women in Sogdian commercial society is incompletely documented, but suggestive of a more active commercial participation than was typical in most ancient societies. The ancient Sogdian letters found at Dunhuang include a document written in the voice of a woman, Nanaidat, who is acting as the commercial representative of a male merchant, managing correspondence and commercial relationships on his behalf. The existence of such a document implies that female commercial agency was at least not unusual in the Sogdian world, and the broader evidence for women's property rights and commercial activity in the Iranian-speaking world, of which Sogdiana was a part, suggests that Sogdian women occupied a more commercially active role than the sparse direct evidence allows us to document fully. The astronomical knowledge that the Sogdians accumulated and transmitted through their commercial networks was another practical intellectual contribution that their commercial orientation had produced. The need to navigate across vast distances using the stars, to calculate the timing of seasonal festivals whose dates were important for religious and commercial reasons, and to predict astronomical events whose occurrence had traditional associations with commercial or agricultural activities, had created incentives for astronomical observation and calculation that the Sogdian oasis cities had developed into a genuine astronomical tradition. The transmission of Central Asian astronomical knowledge to the Islamic world, in which Sogdian and Iranian scholars played significant roles alongside Indian and Greek sources, was one of the contributions that Central Asian learning made to the Islamic scientific tradition of the 9th and 10th centuries CE.
The musical instruments that the Sogdians introduced to East Asia through their commercial and cultural presence in Tang, China, represent one of the most enduring of all Sogdian cultural legacies. The pipa, the Chinese lute that became one of the most important instruments in the Chinese musical tradition, was derived from the Persian and Central Asian barbat through the Sogdian commercial transmission. The specific fingering techniques, tuning systems, and performance traditions that were transmitted alongside the physical instrument shaped the subsequent development of Chinese lute music in ways that are still audible in traditional Chinese music today. The formal garden concerts depicted in Tang paintings, with their elaborately dressed ladies playing the pipa alongside other instruments, are the downstream consequences of the Sogdian musical influence that the ancient letters and frescoes from Sogdiana itself document at their source. The wine culture of Sogdiana, the specific tradition of viticulture, winemaking, and wine consumption that the Zaravshan Valley had developed over centuries, was another Sogdian cultural contribution to the wider world that is rarely acknowledged. The grape varieties, the cultivation techniques, and the wine-making traditions that the Sogdian oases had refined were transmitted eastward into China through the commercial connections that the Silk Road sustained. And the fashion for Central Asian wine in Tang, China, was partly a fashion for specifically Sogdian cultural practice. The Chinese word for grape wine, putaojiu, preserves a linguistic trace of this transmission, the word for grape being borrowed from a Central Asian language into Chinese during the period of commercial contact. The Sogdians introduced the vine and the wine culture to regions that had not previously cultivated it, and the vineyards that the Islamic world has largely replaced with other crops were their agricultural legacy as much as the commercial and cultural ones. The legacy of the Sogdians in the history of commerce is their most significant and most transferable contribution to the subsequent development of world civilization. The specific mechanisms they developed, the use of diaspora networks to reduce transaction costs across long distances, the development of commercial credit instruments that allowed goods to be financed without requiring the physical transfer of precious metals, the institutionalization of commercial information sharing within the network while protecting commercially sensitive information from outsiders, and the cultivation of the trust relationships that made all of these mechanisms function, were not merely historical curiosities, but genuinely innovative solutions to the fundamental problems of long-distance commerce
that subsequent commercial civilizations have had to address in one form or another. The Sogdians did not invent capitalism, but they demonstrated, at the scale of a continent, that the commercial organization of human economic activity across vast distances was possible, that it could be sustained for centuries, and that it could generate prosperity without requiring the support of military conquest. That is a legacy worth understanding. The final paradox of the Sogdians is that they were destroyed not by any failure of their commercial genius, but by the very success of the world they had helped create. The Silk Road commerce that the Sogdians managed was the vehicle through which the civilizations at both ends of the route grew rich enough and powerful enough to make the middlemen unnecessary, and eventually to find direct routes to each other that bypassed the Central Asian oases entirely. The maritime routes that replaced the overland Silk Road were longer in distance, but shorter in time and cheaper in cost, and they left the Sogdian oases without the commercial role that had been the foundation of their prosperity. The entrepreneurs of the ancient Silk Road were victims of the success they had themselves facilitated, a historical irony that the most commercially sophisticated people in the ancient world would certainly have appreciated.